Hello, everyone. My name is Keisha. I am the food program coordinator at Indwell Community Homes, for those of you who are familiar with Indwell. And I also chair the Middlesex London Food Policy Council. Before I give it over to the panelists to introduce themselves, I'm sure Skylar will do this at the end anyway, but I really just want to shout out the Food Policy Council and the planning team for this event. You guys have done such an amazing job. And I'm really happy to be a part of that group and work with such passionate people regarding the food system and all stuff related to it. So shout out to my team. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much. So I'm going to pass it over to our panelists to give a quick introduction of themselves and their work, and then we'll move on to the questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nadia Lambek, and I'm a bit of a maybe strange person here because I'm one of the few researchers in the room. I work at Western, and I work in the law school. I'm a law professor and lawyer, and I study agrarian movements and their engagement in food systems, but also have worked a lot here domestically in Canada on national level campaigns to try and transform our food systems, and worked with NGOs and social movements and civil society groups here for the last 15 years.
Hi everyone, my name is Ms. Furtado. I'm the founder of Diabeat. We are a local charity here, and we primarily support underserved communities who are at risk of type 2 diabetes. And we do this very innovatively because we look at food environments, so their access to ethnic produce. And we also run very specific diabetes programming, so a lot of food literacy for adults, youths, and seniors. And we also do work in, physical movement. So we run like physical activities for, again, seniors, youths, and also adults.
Hi everyone, my name is Matt Wannan, and I'm the manager of the London Food Coalition. And in a world where movies would be more interesting than real life, if this was Cars, I think probably our agency's truck would be a better speaker than me. It definitely has more of a life and more of a role, but you'll learn more about that as we go. We collect food abundance from the community, and then that food goes back out to our member agencies to serve anything from community dinners to faith-based organizations, school programs, shelters, and so on.
Okay, thank you so much. First question here. How has your work or organization contributed to improving equitable access to food in our region? And what are the key challenges you encounter? And this is for everyone. So I'll start with Nadia.
Thank you. So I was having trouble thinking about how to answer this because I'm not a service providing group, but here's my answer. So for the past 15 years, I think my research, my collaborations with civil society and social movements, and my advocacy has all been surrounded around efforts to reshape how we, and by we I mean us in the room, but also government, how we conceptualize and advocate for equitable access, and a shifting away from talking about food security towards talking about food sovereignty, the right to food, agroecology. And along with that, kind of rethinking the relationship between law and access to food, and more often law and inaccess to food. So I don't think, I'm definitely not to credit for this, but I think in the past 15 years or 20 years, there's been subtle but really important changes in Canada in how we think about this question of equitable access, and even the way in which we're asking that question, I think is a subtle change to how that question would have been asked even 20 years ago. So I think this shift is sort of twofold. One, I think we've really changed to thinking about accessibility, both physical and economic accessibility, over thinking about hunger or food insecurity as something about availability. So in doing this sort of shift, and in thinking about the reason in which people don't have access to food, which is largely in Canada because they don't have access to income, we've, I think, started to take much more seriously questions of income inequality, of poverty, of racism, of ableism, of ongoing colonial relations, in the ability of people to meet their own or their food needs. I think it's pretty damning in our country that's so rich. That if you're on if you're on social assistance, you're almost guaranteed in Ontario to be food insecure. And even if you work many jobs, I think the recent statistics are at least 60% of the people who are food insecure report their main income to be through wages. So that's a pretty damning thing. And I think it's been a big shift that we're now talking about poverty and income in relation to inaccessibility of food. The second big shift that I think has happened in the last 20 years is recognizing in a much more serious way government's responsibility and failure to meet obligations that has led to this income insecurity. So if people are unable to access food in Canada, if they have to make a choice between paying rent or buying food, that is a choice that we have made as a country, that our government has made. It is not inevitable. It is not necessary. It is a political choice, and one that could be other. Same with if farmers struggle to make a living through agroecological production, that is a political choice that we've made. If migrant farm workers live in slave-like conditions here in Canada, that is a political choice, and it could be different, and the government, I think, has obligations to change that. And I think that question of government obligation, a move away from just thinking about food insecurity as a charity-based problem that needs to be resolved through charity, I think is a big change. And the question also asked us to think about the challenges in the work we've done. And I think one of the big challenges that we have, and that may have followed from these two big shifts, and one challenge that I think has come up in many people's discussion today is how to talk about this question of food accessibility and inaccessibility in a way that doesn't turn us constantly to a cheap food narrative, that allows us to think about how a farmer could have a good income, how a farm worker could have a good income in Canada, how people could still meet their food needs, and to think of those problems as actually stemming all from the same root causes, and not to have a narrative that pits us against each other, but instead kind of unites us towards collective demands for our government to change how they're doing things.
So for us at Type Diabeat, equitable access means first understanding that availability is not accessibility. So just because a lot of food is around, a lot of food is grown, it doesn't mean that it is actually accessible to everyone. Equitable access also means for us familiarity, food that looks, food that you know, food that you consume every day. And it's also the emotion around when you're trying to access food. So we support about 500 families here in London who are living, in either food insecure homes. And a part of the food that goes into our food box program is actually grown. So we have a collaboration with Cardinal Fine Cabinetry. So we have access to 1.5 acres of land. And this initiative kind of grew from supporting about 30 families with 4 rows at the food bank, growing into a greenhouse at the Western Fair, and now having a bigger greenhouse and land to grow food. We also rescue food. So our food box program is primarily all fresh produce. So we rarely have like meat and dairy, or we don't really give out canned food, because again, cultural access means that yes, maybe there is, surplus amount of a can of tomato soup, but with cultural lens, maybe that is not something that is used in everyday household. It also means empowering and equipping households and being able to consume what is grown here. So something like a spaghetti squash, you can add curry to it, and now you're tapping into multiple demographics that just has, curry spice at home. So we've been able to grow the food, rescue food, partner. We're a member of the London Food Coalition as well. We also rescue about 2,000 pounds of food from Real Canadian Superstore. And we grow primarily most of our Afrocentric foods. So instead of having things like kale, we will have things like kalalu, which is a cousin to like the kale and the regular spinach. We have about 3 variations of the kalalu. We also grow like mustard greens. We also grow collard greens and Swiss chard. And we grow things like okras as well. So looking at how food traveled around the world and intersects other cultures, and how can we provide that to families, but very heavily on the food literacy. Because just because, we might know how to cook a rutabaga or a pumpkin, it doesn't mean that a lot of our kids in, going to school and community might even understand how to cook these foods. So we feel like we're really able to address that, and also understanding the emotion. So a lot of times agencies that provide support have a very, the view of needs might look different. So I think if we think of someone in need, we might all have a specific picture come to mind. So when faces like myself might walk into certain of these spaces, they might not look typically or traditionally like someone that has a need. And sometimes that can always lead to like feelings of maybe not feeling safe or not feeling welcome. So what we've been able to do with our food box program is that we do a designated box per family. So you either get a call or a text, and then you're asked to come in. So that's what we've been able to do. And we also have like a community shelf whereby people can shop for additional items and donations. Like if we do get meat or we do get feminine products or household products, we can put it on the shelf and put a little bit of dignity into it so they get to shop and take what they need. Because cultural and equitable access is understanding that no one migrates to Canada to end up on welfare or accessing a food box program. And if you're gonna take 2-3 buses to come downtown to pick up food, you clearly have that need, right? So as someone who's been on low income housing, who's been on welfare, like walking into spaces to access food and you've never done that before in your life is very scary. And if you don't see faces or food that's familiar to you, you can walk away. So even imagine like attending an event and it's a very big event and you don't see food on a table that you've eaten before, you might not try anything from that table. So really using food as a vehicle and a tool to address greater issues, which is also socioeconomic issues, language barrier, where you live, like, what access to grocery stores you have next to you or in the houses that you live. So, and then the problems that we encounter in food distribution is the manpower, right? So volunteering is a privilege, and not everyone who are living in food insecure homes or who are working 2-3 jobs have the opportunity to volunteer. So then the cost of running a food box program is very expensive, but we primarily rely on volunteers. So something that we struggle with is like volunteers to go pick up the food. Well, we've been able to have very strong, committed volunteers because in all these years, it's been all volunteers. We feel really blessed to have people who believe in our cause. But as an organization, we know that there is a cost, there's gas to go pick up the food, right? So we hope being able to be in a position to at least provide gas cards, moving forward. And potentially being able to hire someone to oversee, because 500 families is a lot. And to have a list that we've never marketed is not something that, I don't like to glorify poverty, but to have such a rapid growth talks about the need in the community. But then also there's all these layers to also try to provide and support those needs. So for us, heavily would be around like accessing manpower.
I would say I agree with Mystery around the first part. I agree with everything you say. But I think for us, what's ultimately really important is the distribution piece. So absolutely, there is enough food to go around. There's more food in London than what we need as a city, but we're not getting it to the people that need food the most. And so what we do at the Food Coalition is we have 28 members right now that come a few times a week. They pick up food that's been donated that we've collected and brought back in with our truck and then take it out to their organizations. I said earlier that could be shelters or school programs, faith-based community meals and so on. So it's getting out to where it needs to be sort of that day. What are the things if you come tomorrow that will be perhaps less interesting is that we probably won't have anything left by the time the lunch actually happens tomorrow when you come for the tour. It's really just it's a quick morning thing. Food comes in around, it's picked up between 6 and 9 o'clock, and it comes in, it's sorted. We make sure it's quality controlled and put out. And then our agencies come in shortly after that, and usually by the end of the day, everything is gone except bananas. We always have bananas. That's the thing about bananas, they're always there. I think they grow at night. And so, I mean, that's kind of the beauty of it, and you can watch it happen while you're there during the day. I think that one of the things we've been able to do is bring that sort of community together where perhaps before maybe there wasn't a whole lot of conversation across agencies about food and food rescue and what we were able to do with that. And I think it's different now because that does happen. We're also able to sort of, I mean, we get to know our agencies and we know what they might like or need, and so we're able to watch for that in a way that perhaps it's harder to do in a larger way, or if there wasn't, I mean, we too work with volunteers, so our volunteers kind of, it's like having your own private shopper with you, so they also get to know you. You have the same volunteer every Tuesday, so they get to know what you're looking for and can help with that. And then I think just sort of more generally, just the logistics of it. We have a system in place that we've been able to develop. We have the refrigerated truck, we have storage space for food, refrigerator space, freezer space, and so on. We're fortunate to have that because we're in Glencairn Community Resource Center, so we have the space that's been provided to us. But definitely, you know, if you were recreating a food coalition or doing this all over, having that space and that infrastructure is super important. Other challenges, of course, are the infrastructure, the truck. If our truck breaks down and we don't have a truck for a day, it's, you know, it could be thousands of pounds of food that don't go out into the community that day. We collect about 10,000 on average, which is a pretty big number when it's given where it's like, you know, in a small area. So definitely impact of not being able to operate is big on our agencies. And then also the variability as well. We never know exactly what we're going to get. Some days it's food abundance, and some days, I mean, you know, not to belabor, but some days it's just bananas. And then again, you kind of have to work with that. And, you know, we've done lots of things to stretch bananas or make them into other things and so on. So that's a big part of the challenge as well. I think the other challenges are, you know, same as what you said as well. It's just around volunteers, having that consistency, having the ability to serve our members as best as we can, keeping the space in a way that looks kind of nice. I mean, everything that we receive comes in boxes that are kind of, you know, often if it's coming from a store, it's a box of a whole bunch of things. We don't want to put that out. So having it look and feel like it's kind of a grocery store, but it's still a warehouse and you're still just picking food out of plastic bins instead of cardboard boxes. But just keeping all those things going so it does feel like an equitable experience. And then beyond that, I think the big piece for me is just that understanding that I myself and my team aren't frontline workers, so we're not actually giving that food to people who need it. We're giving it to agencies to use it. And it's hard to explain that sometimes to make it sound as though we're actually having that same sort of impact or that we're part of that process. We work in food distribution, but we are still part of the process of getting food out into the community.
Okay, thank you so much for those answers. I'm going to jump to the panelist specific questions, and then if we have time, we'll jump back to question 2. So this first one is for Matthew and Mystery. What strategies or partnerships have been most successful in increasing food recovery and redistribution, and how could these approaches be scaled or replicated? And we'll start with Mystery.
So I've been pondering a lot about scalability and how things can be replicable, and also understanding that sometimes impact is not scalable, which is sometimes a hard truth to grasp when we live in a society where everything needs to be bigger, faster, and more. So for us, in talking about what has been successful for us, it has heavily been partnerships. And partnerships are great when people understand why partnerships matter, because partnerships take time to build, right? So if you're a small organization like ours that has 2-3 people on staff, somewhat, to be able to sit there and send emails and wait for people to get back to you, can be very exhausting and time consuming. So when you're out there dealing with people who are walking in with, 5 kids and they're hungry, they just lost their job, they paid rent and know they can't afford food, and then they're thinking, oh, how can I get a job? So we get so much needs and requests that we don't have the capacity, capability, or mental power to even process. And that is because most of it is either coming to my desk or most of our volunteers. So in terms of success, I find that when we work with organizations that understand that there is intentional and unintentional biases and racism in the structures that we all live in and operate in and provide food in, we find that our impact is really, really great, because sometimes it's hard for people to understand or believe or want to accept that they might be causing harm or intentionally causing harm in a hierarchical structure when it comes to equitable access, people of color, understanding culture. It is a hard conversation, but we've been very fortunate to work with organizations and groups that, care to do better and change and understand and learn. And for instance, the land that we have access to, it's all from just talking to the right person who connected us to someone that had land, right? And for this year, we were able to work with the patch, and we had someone for 12 weeks to water, to harvest, to do all these great things. So I think at the heart of any work that wants to be replicated is who's aligned in your area, who's doing what, and how can we work together? Because sometimes it's not always funding, it is that human power. So being able to tap into an entire individual for 12 weeks that's learning about Afrocentric food, that's a big part of the food that goes out into community, has really been very impactful. I would also say, again, tapping into resource centers. We work a lot with resource centers as well to run our program. We have a space for distribution. So I think very much for us, the success is collaboration, and it's also communication and talking. The more we know what we're each doing and we're not operating in silos, the stronger impact can be together, right? Because we can't solve all of these issues by ourselves, but definitely by working together and finding ways to work together and being intentional about those partnerships, we've seen the most success in our work. So we're really grateful for the groups we work with, the people that we talk to who point us in the right direction, and for the work that we've been able to do here in London.
I think for the Food Coalition, in terms of strategy, consistency, if we're talking about scale, having daily pickup, having a truck, having all the infrastructure in place is great. I think in terms of scale or doing more, ideally having more food hubs connected to the same sort of process. So an overarching sort of structure, but having more places to do it and more access and more food. There's definitely more food to be collected. I just don't know where all that food would go. And I joke about bananas, but we actually have a lot of food and a lot of depth of food. And some days it's more of a challenge to get food out than it is to get food in. So trying to, you're almost doing a sales job with agencies on what you can do with things that perhaps they haven't seen before. That's a really beautiful thing, because then you also get to try, or not try, but you get to have agencies and people trying a lot of things they haven't had before as well. And I heard Allison in the last talk about trust, and I think that's also totally a part of it. It's just developing those relationships where you can, for us, work with an agency, tell them about something that we've had in, explain how it can be used, explain perhaps the cultural relevance of it, and then it's more usable than something that they just see sitting on the table. I always use celeriac as an example because we got a lot of it once. We didn't know what to do with it. We had a volunteer that actually was from Turkey and knew all about celeriac and how it could be used. And then we put out her recipe and it was gone. And that's just a really great thing to be able to do that and know that someone's trying that in a way that they may not have been able to do it before. I think that I think there's also opportunities for more sharing with across agencies and across food hubs in terms of some of the elements of the piece for me. Like, we don't always have drivers, so we rely on our driver. But I mean, if they get sick, I need to find a backup driver or a volunteer driver. No one gets sick conveniently at 4 o'clock in the afternoon the day before. They get sick in the morning, and so you're out a driver in the morning. So it's hard to sometimes find those pieces, but having agencies, which we've done now, that have drivers within them that can help us, that's been hugely helpful as well. So sharing the work, because it is actually, I'm sure it's the same for you, it's a really small number of people who do this. Right now there's 3 of us, so it's 2 full-time staff equivalent. And it's a lot for 3 people and volunteers to kind of keep it running. It is like Groundhog Day in that every day is the same. You get excited to go to work, and then you wait for the truck to come, and then you unload the truck, and then the food is gone, and then you go home. It's kind of the same process every day, but it's still exciting because, again, you never know what you're going to get. And then there's also the stories that come back, right? One day we had a lot of burgers. One agency happened to be having, an end of summer event for their clients. That's nice, but then also seeing that a week later on social media and knowing that, that's the food that you channeled back out there, that has a really huge impact on you. And I think that there's tons of ways to describe that and tons of those stories. It's just a matter of sort of being of watching for it and listening for it, and it's a great thing. So in terms of scale, I think that's something else too, is just sort of knowing the narrative and being able to use that narrative to encourage volunteers to participate, and also see that food as abundance and not food that needs to get thrown away. And for me, I think that's a big part of it, is that there is a perception that this food just would have been tossed and could have been tossed, and it's really great food. It's food that absolutely should still be consumed and be used for in the community. And then I think the other piece of that too is making connections with agencies that have the wraparound supports that's needed. So it's not just food as emergency; it's food as healthcare, mental health, addiction supports, and so on. And I think the wraparound piece is really important, that we're not, for the rest of our lives, working towards emergency food rescue or emergency food. It's actually developing the systems to help people to not need emergency food anymore. To me, that's the goal for the Food Hub. No one wants to go out of business, but if we did, because people didn't need to rescue food anymore because it was adequately distributed and everyone had some, I'd like to think someone would hire me somewhere else for that, right? Like, whoever develops that system is golden. I think it's just what we need to work towards.
Thank you. Moving on, a question for Nadia. Based on your research and experience in food law and policy, what legal or policy strategies could be most effective in creating actionable change to improve equitable access to food in our region?
Thank you. I think I'm going to give a disappointing answer to this question because it's hard for me to pick out a kind of particular law or policy that we could change or could implement. And I think there's a tendency to think about law or to imagine law as something that could be useful and helpful and save us, and we could get our rights guaranteed. But I think in the conversation today, I can't help but think about a kind of big piece that's missing from what we've been discussing, and that's the role of the state and of law in so much of what we do, and not often as a helper, but more often as an inhibitor to the kinds of progress that so many people in this room have talked about today. So I think one of the kind of big things that we could do and should do collectively is map the ways in which law, at different scales, from the city up to the federal to the international, map the ways in which law and the underlying logics and ideologies that underscore them, the ways in which it is often detrimental to the work that we want to do. So that could be big scale questions. I mean, we've talked a lot about small scale ecological, agroecological, diversified production, and obviously that's the direction forward. I think we all know that. So why is it so hard? Why is ag policy in Canada so focused on industrial exports that leads to massive scale production, to input heavy agriculture, to consolidation, to financialization of the farm system? Why is that our legal and policy direction forward? Why is that our plan for economic growth in Canada? And why do we have laws and policies that support that path and make it so hard to do something else? On the kind of food accessibility question, why have we relegated in Canada, such a rich country, that all the main solutions to food insecurity need to be in the charity sector? What would it mean to actually recognize government responsibility? What would it mean to have OW and ODSP in Ontario actually allow people to have a dignified livelihood? What would it mean to change our employment laws to have less precarious work, more benefits? That would be a true change, I think, to addressing accessibility, but it requires changing the laws that we have, not necessarily introducing new ones. And then there are kind of smaller scale things. I mean, I could think about for each sort of speaker that's been up today, what kind of legal things are impeding them. So Mike talked about this morning about building a processing plant on his farm. So how does on-farm diversified use zoning laws impede him from doing that? What kind of rules make it so hard to have land trusts? Laura this morning, why can't people save seeds in Canada? Why do we have all these IP protections that make it so hard for people to pass on seeds and that allow some companies to benefit from knowledge that people have had for time in memoriam? I teach property law. Why can't we change the property law rules that led to land being taken away to begin with and that make it so hard to recognize Indigenous claims to land today? All of those laws could be different and we could change them. So I guess my answer to this question is not what could we do, but how could we change what we have and how could we work together to kind of map the ways in which law and policy makes it so hard for everybody in this room to do the really important work that you're doing.
Thank you all so much for your answers. I think we're going to move into audience questions now. So if anyone has a question, feel free to put your hand up and I will bring you the mic, or you can join the Slido on your phone and submit it online.
I am Paul from Harvest Dairies. I don't know if this is fact, but I've heard this a few times that there are large grocery store enterprises that will work with a grower, enforce that grower in the contract to sign saying they're not allowed to sell any excess product. Is that, in your world, is that fiction or is that fact? I've never been able to validate that.
I don't know about that off the top of my head. Certainly contract farming is a thing in many places of the world. I think maybe a little bit less so here, but there are certainly incentives from the government to grow certain kinds of crops and not other crops, and incentives. I mean, I was struck by Crispin this morning saying, oh man, I'd love to grow organically, but I just can't afford it. And so I think thinking about what the mechanisms that make it so hard for someone to grow organically is the big question. And I don't know if contract farming is part of that. In Ontario. I'm sorry, that's not my area of expertise, but certainly contract farming has often been to the detriment of farmers. And yeah, again, we have very few grocery stores who control quite a lot in our country. We know about the ones in the south. We haven't even talked about the ones in the north because we're talking regional here, but that's a big problem, yeah.
So one of the questions that came in the Slido is, speaking of barriers, are there any municipal bylaws or rules that you've run into issues with in your work?
Currently, from our perspective, most of it just has to do with like the health unit to make sure that the food is off the ground, that you have refrigerators, so you do have like the health unit coming to check on you. So they actually have, I'm not sure if it's a law or bylaw, but they have space for food bank operations that the health unit recognizes, so you don't have to pay any fees or you're not held by any laws, more just like safe food, that people should have their safe food handlings, you should have a hand washing station, and that food that needs to be refrigerated goes in the refrigerator. For us, it's more so I think the laws that sometimes grocery store owners are held by, or maybe they're scared. So I know that with some of the grocery stores, they're not even allowed to give out the food that is going bad, especially if they're owned by like a corporation. If they're privately owned by like a family, then they can decide, I will do this, but then they do get repercussions. So at one point we were getting, I think, stuff from Shoppers, and then that stopped, and we had quite a few families who were really enjoying getting, you know, the Tylenol, the Advil, some of the beauty products that might be really expensive for them to purchase, but because of laws that they're held by, that they could get sued, the medication is expired, things like that. So I think more so the grocery stores have more to worry about with getting sued that prevent them from maybe doing more. That has been like our experience.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. There is Good Samaritan law that makes it a bit easier to work around food, that, you know, you can have food and you can give that food away, and if something goes off with that food, you're not held responsible for it. But definitely we're in the same situation, you know, when it comes to medicines, beauty products, products that have alcohol in it. I don't even mean alcoholic beverages, but we had something come in yesterday that had 12% alcohol. It was cooking alcohol at 12%, and I mean, that isn't something that we're going to be able to put out. Even hand sanitizer is problematic. So I would say that. And then, you know, we are fully held because it's community center to the health and safety regulations and everything too. So I mean, even that's tricky sometimes. Just, you know, being always conscious of where you're putting food and how you're handling food. It definitely adds appropriately, but it adds time into the day for sure.
Thank you. And I have to thank all of you, all the speakers today, because it's just been like so enlightening. And I have a question for you, Nadia, because I was really struck by the two things you said when you were answering your last question. So one being, what are the legal, what's the system now and the legal pieces of the system now that we should kind of break down rather than adding more things to. But then the other thing you said is that question about, you know, really coming to terms with government obligation. And government to me is like everybody, right? Like it's like community, right? So I'm wondering if there's, and you talked specifically about that responsibility, so it doesn't land in the charity realm, right? Like this is a responsibility. Every community has a responsibility to feed the people that live there, right? That's our common responsibility for each other. Is there anything that supersedes law on that? So for example, I love the idea of mapping out all of the legal pieces and all of the barriers, but I'm a policy wonk, and like I know that that's not shared by a lot of people. I mean, I would really get into that, but I feel like that's a lot for people to do. But I wonder if there's anything that like supersedes that in terms of, is there a way for elected officials or a community to sort of state values and like what they stand for and the principles that they're around that would then make it easier to address the laws that impede that happening? Is that a thing?
Yeah, so of course anybody could decide what principles want to govern what they do, but and use those as a basis for law. And in Canadian law, it's our charter that does that, and maybe our international human rights obligations. We chose not to recognize any economic, social, cultural rights in our charter when we, no, we don't have a right to food in Canada. We don't have a right to housing. We have a right to life, liberty, and security of the person. People have tried to claim that there's a right to housing in that. The courts have said, no, there's not. That's a challenge that we face. But yes, of course, there are guiding principles. I mean, the food sovereignty definition that was put up on the board, imagine if we said, okay, we're gonna be committed to food sovereignty. And some countries have said that. What would it look like to then re-change our laws in that respect? What if we were to recognize the right to food? There have been movements in Canada to try and have us recognize the right to food. At the debates about the national food policy, that was a strong push from civil society. It was ultimately unsuccessful. But what would it mean to kind of to reimagine food systems in that way? There's the right to food has a complicated definition in international law, but the current UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, who happens to be Canadian, has this beautiful way of defining it not in kind of legal jargon. And he says, the right to food is how we show love to each other. It's how we pass on community. It's how we pass on our history. It's how we take care of each other. It's all about love. So what would it be to reimagine the laws that govern our food system with that in mind? And whether that's at the local level or at the international level, you could imagine something very, very different. And again, I don't think anybody has done this yet in Canada, but for example, Toronto has a Black food sovereignty policy plan that's, maybe I'll pass it on, but it's a really interesting way to think about racial justice in the food system, what it would mean to think about food justice more deeply and how we do law and policy at the municipal level. It's a very interesting, I don't know if they've actually put it deeply into practice, but it's a beautiful vision of how to redo policy. Yeah, I don't know if you know more about how it's been implemented.
Yes, so I'm not heavily in policy, but because of our line of work, I've had the privilege to travel to a few provinces in Canada to learn what others are doing. And I think the first step is knowledge that there is better. Mm-hmm. That's why events like this matter. So before we can map anything, we need to know what we're doing. And what I find for us in Southwestern Ontario, we're really detached from some of the great work that is happening. And we become, I don't want to say complacent, but almost hopeless that this is the only way our work needs to look. So Toronto has been able to hold their city council accountable, and they actually launched a Black food sovereignty. They have an entire document, and certain resources centers and Jane and Finch actually hold this to standard. They implement, and they have actual schools that follow it. So I'm part of the Black School Foods Working Group that meets every month, and their job is using from that strategy, or I'm not sure if it's a policy or what's the legal term, or a city bylaw, but it's almost like a right to food to support non-ACB organization to be able to adopt and find cultural food, find farmers, and hold the city council accountable for food insecurity that is not just a responsibility of the charitable sector, but as well of the city council. So here in London, I was trying to look, but of course that takes a lot of time. How can we come together and do the same thing with our city council, whereby there is a movement, there is people that are meeting that's talking about it, and that also has that equity lens.
Okay, in the interest of time, if anyone has any other questions, I would invite you to talk to any of the panelists after we are done. You can probably get their information as well, and I'm sure they'd be happy to connect with you outside of this. We also have our Food for Thought board over in where the exhibits are. You should still have sticky notes on your table, so you can write some stuff down there as well and put it on that board. And yeah, could we give one big round of applause for our speakers?